So today I'd like to talk to you about a subject that's been close to my heart for some time. I want to talk to you about my postdoc and about my dad's dementia. So I'll sum up my reason for speaking out in the first line of this talk. I want to contribute to the discussion about how there should be more than one way to structure an academic career, and about how requiring multiple moves between countries or even cities excludes people for reasons that might not be obvious. Not everyone wants to or can do two major geographical moves before setting up a lab. And I want to encourage as many people as possible to question that narrative. I've read blogs that have discussed the so-called two-body problem of academics in couples finding it hard to get good jobs in the same location, but I've not found any blogs online discussing situations similar to mine. So I wrote one, and now I'm talking about it too. So what's your role now? That main point said, I'll backtrack to give a little bit of context. I'm doing a postdoc at the Sanger Institute, based in Cambridge, UK, and I'm currently working on the molecular biology methods for single-cell sequencing. So far so good, but when folks ask the next set of obvious questions about where I've been before, a predictable set of questions and answers, assumptions tend to jump in. So where were you before? I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute too, getting a molecular biology protocol to work to measure gene activity, a flavour of a method called RNA-seq that we called DAFT-seq. And that was in the human malaria parasite Plasmodium falciparum. Cool. And before that is what some people ask next. Before that, I did my undergraduate and master's degree in biochemistry at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. After that, these are the kinds of questions that people have often asked. And with hindsight, the answers I wish I'd always given. Question 1. Oh, so you must really like Cambridge then? I mean, it's quite nice, but there are other places I'd also like. I don't dislike the place, but honestly, that's not the main reason I still live here. Question 2. Are you worried what will happen if you change labs? No. I've been in 5 different labs since I started at Sanger, including more than a year in DNA pipelines, which is a very different place from the scientific programs and much more like industry. I've also been in 4 scientific programs, which are more like departments, each of which has a very different style of science and leadership. The third question. Do you have kids? Should it matter if I do? I don't, but I think that's beside the point, as though this is a valid reason that I'm allowed not to move. And on top of all that, I've only been asked this since around the point I turned 30. Another question. Do you not want to run your own lab then? I think this is massive over-extrapolation from the data provided, which I think is built on the premise that if I was really serious about being a group leader, I'd have made different choices, as I'm not following the classic path of moving twice between countries before trying to set up a lab. Question 5. Are you scared to move countries? There's so much to unpack there that it's probably a whole other blog article. For now, let's just say that if you saw me unleashed into a new place with a phrasebook, a map, and an excuse to talk to the locals, you probably wouldn't ask that question. Maybe you think that some of those questions are reasonable to ask someone you know well, and maybe you don't. But I think all of them are pretty intrusive from someone that I met 2 minutes ago in the line for coffee at a conference. Being asked these questions still happens very regularly, to the extent that I'm surprised when I manage to get through a whole conference without at least one of those questions being asked. When I moved from my PhD to my first job at Sanger, I used to gently duck them. I used to move the conversation onto something else. But now I almost always address those questions head on. The intention is to both break the taboos around the subject and to make the other person think twice before they make the same kind of assumptions again. So why am I still at Sanger? Well, you asked nicely with an open-ended question, so I'll give you a direct answer. It's got two parts. Part one. I want to do world-class genomics in the south of England. And I think there's few that would argue that Sanger's a terrible play for this. I think it's actually pretty good. Part two is that I want to be in the south of England so that I can easily get back to family as my dad goes through dementia. It's much easier to handle if I can get home regularly without too much forward planning. I was just letting that hang there for a second. That second point tends to stop people in their tracks. Dementia, like I've called it the D word. When I mention dementia, some folks briefly share that someone close to them has been through this too. I don't need to share the whole story with everyone I meet, but I'm happy to talk about it. Others are horrified that they accidentally brought up the subject and will do absolutely anything to end or redirect the conversation. But if you ask me too many intrusive questions in a row, I don't think it's unfair that I make you at least briefly uncomfortable. What is dementia? Happy to talk about it. Dementia is an umbrella term. It describes a range of progressive disorders where the nerves slowly become damaged to the point where the brain can't function anymore. The most common kind of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, but there are many more. These basically reflect which part of the brain is damaged first. The blog I wrote has some links with excellent sources of information that are useful for patients, family, friends and colleagues, and I hope we can share the link later. My dad's diagnosis was dementia with Lewy bodies. That has the confusion that most people associate with Alzheimer's disease, along with some of the movement difficulties that overlap with Parkinson's disease. People with Lewy body dementia tend to live about 6 to 12 years after symptoms first appear. Me, my dad, and dementia. It's okay to ask about what that experience was like, but I can tell you that it's hard to listen to. So I'll be brief, so not to make you turn off this talk now on account of too much intensity. My dad died last summer, about 11 years after the problems with movement were first recognised, and about 10 years after it was officially diagnosed as Lewy body dementia, but we'd suspected it for a while before. Around 5 years ago now, he needed more care than we could give in our family home, so we moved him to a specialist care home. I can't say enough nice things about the people who are the staff in that care home. It must be an incredibly hard job. To give you a flavour of my experiences, I'll pick a comparison that I think is something many of you might be familiar with. To me, it felt like the reverse of watching a small child grow independent in the world. A couple of years ago, and still now, I'm watching my friends' toddlers take their first independent steps, to be able to say their first words, their first sentences, and to zip up their own jackets. At about the same time, I was watching my dad no longer be able to do those things and have to rely on help from others around him. I watched him slowly fade over a decade, with there being little that I could do but be there for him and for close family. It totally sucked, and I don't see any point being indirect about that. That decade, where my dad faded, was also the 10 years that covered half of my undergraduate degree, my PhD, and 3 other roles at Sanger. At the beginning, I barely talked about it, as the changes in my dad weren't necessarily obvious to others, and didn't necessarily make day-to-day changes in my life. But those small changes accumulate and creep up step by step. At what point should I talk about them? One of the hardest steps was signing the paperwork that meant my dad wasn't legally capable of making his own decisions anymore. But that step followed many smaller ones, like moving sharp knives or hiding keys he might lose. People often assume that the hardest year was the one running up to where he died. For me, it wasn't. The hardest year or two were the ones just before he moved into the care home, where he needed more help than we could give, but wasn't willing to accept that. And in particular, the 8 months we spent at the top of the waiting list, desperately hoping for a place to become available at that specialist care home. I was about a week away from quitting my job and moving home when that place finally became available. With hindsight, I view the whole experience as something like a hurricane blowing through my family's life. The beginnings of the storm were when the symptoms first appeared 12 years ago or so. The eye of the storm was probably the year when we made the decision to put him into the specialist care home. And almost a year after he died, I think we're still rebuilding the damage after that storm. I think we're still figuring out what the new normal looks like, even though it's been around 5 years since my dad was living at home. The whole experience has definitely changed how I view life. For a number of years, I've really tried to make sure that I don't let being in touch with the people I care about slip, as you can't predict the future. Talking in the spring of 2020, there's a lot of uncertainty about how to plan for tomorrow, next week, the future. My family lived with uncertainty for almost 12 years, and it's definitely changed how I view what's happening now, and hopefully leaves me better prepared to help others through this than I could have been otherwise. That's about dementia, the first D word. I want to talk about another D word, depression. It'd feel like an omission not to talk about this other complicating factor that made my dad's dementia much harder, both to deal with directly and to talk about to others, and that's depression. So my dad had depression for almost 30 years in total, of which the last 11 overlapped with his dementia. My dad thought about it as something he shouldn't talk about, based on the attitudes in society when he was growing up. It's only in the last 5 years or so that I've even mentioned it to anyone but those closest to me. But thankfully, attitudes are changing fast, and more people talk about it now. But why do I mention it here? I'm mentioning it here because in the early stages of my dad's dementia, talking about it felt really similar to discussing his depression in public. Too taboo, too private, too uncomfortable. I'll be glad when we get to the point where society lets us talk about both openly. Career choices. I made the decision to be within reach of home not long after the official diagnosis, at the point when I was thinking about applying for PhDs. I applied for a bunch of PhD places within the south of England and accepted the place at Sanger, which is the one I wanted the most. The most obvious choices for after PhD for me all involved moves that would mean I was dependent on a combination of flights, coaches, buses, trains, etc., all working to be able to get home. I decided that I wasn't willing to do that regularly over what would probably be the worst years of my dad's dementia. Distance to home really mattered in the last 18 months or so because he stopped being able to use a phone to talk to me. For me, at least, I decided that I could live with an unconventional career path more easily than I could not being around for my family when it counted. But what surprised me is how much everyone else has an opinion on that choice, or at least the most visible parts. I understand that variety in scientific training is generally a good thing, with ideas and people from all over the world mixing. But I'd argue that two nearby labs that don't work together can be more different than two geographically distant labs whose science overlaps much more closely. What helped and what would have helped with hindsight? Hopefully it's clear that this part is subjective, but I hope it might make it easier to begin a conversation with someone in a similar position. Open questions. The simplest advice I can give is to ask open questions like, how are you? Or how are things with family? With time for the other person to answer. Just hold that pause. Slightly longer than you might have done. They might not want to talk about it right now, but if the space to answer the question has gone before they've had time to think about it, the odds are that they won't give you an answer unless there's a pressing need, which means that you'll only hear about it when it becomes urgent and they can't make a deadline or they have to leave work right now. Escapes. It really helped me to have parts of my life that weren't connected to what was happening at home. That could be work, that could be friends that didn't bring it up unless I brought it up. But equally important were the friends who would ask me directly, even if I didn't bring it up. I needed both. I still count some of my past colleagues as good friends today. Quotas. Quotas is a concept that I heavily borrowed from a blog post called The Awesomest 7-Year Postdoc, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Tenure Track Life. I've linked this from my blog post and would recommend it to anyone who works in science. This blog talked about hard quotas, and I use them for time at work, weekends in Cambridge, and weekends with family, and time spent visiting or meeting with friends. It helped with the closest I got to balance, and it was a defense against total burnout. Knowing there's more than one way to do it. Every story of someone who's not followed a classic path is an antidote to the narrative that there is only one way to succeed in academia. Time will tell what I do after this postdoc, but honestly, I stopped caring quite a while ago what other people think about what I should do. People that I could trust. So you know who you are, and I probably still owe you a beer or cake for 70, to be honest, for all your thanks. Thanks for your time and kindness. Some of you proofread the blog article, some of you told me it was okay to speak out, and some of you are probably listening now. Thanks again to those folks. And to end, thanks for listening. I hope it's something that you can use a catalyst for conversation, and that the more people who talk about this, the fewer taboos there will be. I'd love you to get in touch. We can answer questions at the end of this session. Also, you can find me on Twitter. Here's my Twitter handle. No expense spared with the props. And yeah, thanks for listening, and hope this can begin a conversation. Thanks.